The galaxy had always believed that hyperspace was a road, dangerous, unpredictable, but ultimately understood. It was a current that could be charted, mapped, and bent to the will of those who dared to cross it. But in the cold, uncharted void beyond the known hyperlanes, in a region so unstable that even the most daring navigators refused to name it, something tore that belief apart. There was no warning, no signal, no gravitational anomaly detected by Imperial sensors or whispered through the Force. One moment, the darkness between stars was silent and absolute. The next, it screamed. The rupture did not behave like a storm or a singularity. It unfolded like a wound, raw, violent, and impossibly vast, ripping through hyperspace itself and spilling its contents into real space. Energy unlike anything ever recorded surged outward in waves, distorting starlight and bending the vacuum into unnatural shapes. Imperial deep space monitoring stations, scattered sparsely along the edge of the unknown regions, registered the anomaly only as cascading system failures. Instruments fried. Navigation arrays collapsed into useless static. Entire stations vanished from sensors as if they had never existed. And then, from within that tear in reality, something emerged. It began with fire, massive warships tumbling violently out of the rift, their hulls scorched by forces they were never meant to endure. These vessels did not resemble anything catalogued in Imperial databases. Their designs were unfamiliar, brutal, and functional, bearing the marks of a civilization hardened by endless war. Engines roared not with the hum of repulsor lifts or ion drives, but with a deeper, more aggressive energy signature that clashed violently with the surrounding fabric of space. These were Terran battlecruisers, dragged unwillingly through a dimensional collapse, their crews disoriented but alive, their weapons still armed, their instincts still sharpened by conflict. They were not alone. Trailing behind them came something far worse, something that did not belong to any known classification of life or machine. At first, it appeared as debris, organic matter scattered across the void, drifting in grotesque clusters. But the fragments moved. They pulsed. They grew. Tendrils of living tissues stretched outward, anchoring themselves to asteroids, to derelict hulls, to anything they could consume. Within moments, those fragments began to merge, forming structures that defied reason, structures that breathed and expanded with horrifying purpose. The Zerg had arrived, not as an organized fleet, but as a living infestation already adapting to its new environment, already evolving in response to the unseen currents of this galaxy. And then, cutting through the chaos with deliberate precision, came the Protoss. Their ships did not tumble or drift. They emerged in perfect formation, golden hulls gleaming even in the dim light of distant stars, their energy fields stabilizing instantly as if the rupture itself had been anticipated. Where the Terrans struggled to regain control and the Zerg spread uncontrollably, the Protoss adapted within seconds, their psionic presence rippling outward like a second, alien force. Their arrival was not chaotic. It was calculated, observant, and deeply, profoundly aware. For a brief moment, the three factions existed in silence, suspended in a void that was no longer empty but violently alive with new possibilities. Then the war resumed. Terran targeting systems locked onto the nearest unknown vessels, their commanders reacting with instinctive aggression born from survival. Protoss ships responded with equal swiftness, their weapons firing beams of energy that cut through space with surgical precision. And the Zerg, sensing both threat and opportunity, surged toward everything, their forms multiplying, adapting, consuming. The unknown regions, once silent and untouched, became a battlefield in an instant, lit by explosions, energy discharges, and the sickening growth of alien biology spreading across the void. But this was only the beginning. Far from the chaos, deep within the heart of the galaxy, a disturbance rippled through the Force, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. It was not the familiar tremor of conflict or death. It was something else, something alien, something that did not flow with the Force but pressed against it, distorted it, challenged it. In the shadows of imperial power, seated upon a throne built on fear and control, Emperor Palpatine opened his eyes. He did not need sensors or reports. He felt it. A presence unlike anything he had encountered, vast and multifaceted, neither wholly light nor dark, neither fully bound to the Force nor entirely separate from it. It was as if three distinct storms had entered his domain simultaneously, each carrying its own philosophy, its own power, its own defiance of the natural order he had spent a lifetime mastering. His fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his throne, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous, interest. Elsewhere, aboard a star destroyer cutting through hyperspace with relentless purpose, Darth Vader felt it too. The sensation was jarring, like a disruption in the very fabric of existence, a signal that something had entered the galaxy that did not belong. His connection to the Force strained to interpret it, to understand it, but it offered no clear answer. Only conflict. Only change. Back in the unknown regions, the battle intensified. Terran vessels, now regaining control, began forming defensive formations, their commanders issuing rapid orders as they attempted to assess their situation. They were no strangers to alien threats, but this was different. This was not just another battlefield. This was an entirely new universe, one that operated under rules they did not yet understand. Yet even in uncertainty, they fought with discipline, their weapons tearing into Zerg masses and clashing with Protoss shields in bursts of destructive light. The Protoss, meanwhile, adapted with unsettling speed. Their psionic senses extended beyond the immediate battlefield, probing the surrounding space, detecting the faint but undeniable presence of something vast, something that permeated this galaxy in a way their own powers did not. The Force. It was not like their connection to the Kala, but it resonated, faintly, like an echo of something familiar yet fundamentally different. And within that resonance, they sensed imbalance. Corruption. A darkness that stretched far beyond this initial conflict. The Zerg needed no such understanding. They felt only hunger. The biomass drifting from the rupture had already begun to anchor itself to nearby celestial bodies, spreading across their surfaces in grotesque patterns of growth. Creatures began to emerge, small at first, then larger, more complex, each iteration shaped by the new environment, by the strange energies saturating this galaxy. And within that evolution, something unexpected occurred. The Zerg began to react to the Force. Not consciously. Not yet. But their mutations shifted in response to it, their forms adapting not just to physical threats, but to an unseen influence that guided life itself in this galaxy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it marked the beginning of something far more dangerous than simple infestation. It marked the beginning of evolution that even the Sith could not have predicted. Across the stars, the consequences began to ripple outward. Imperial patrol routes near the unknown regions went dark, their transmissions cut off mid-report. Trade routes shifted as whispers of living ships and impossible invaders spread through the outer rim. Smugglers and bounty hunters, ever opportunistic, began to take notice, drawn by the promise of profit in chaos. And within the rebellion, scattered intelligence reports hinted at a threat unlike the Empire, something that could not be reasoned with, something that consumed rather than conquered. The galaxy was changing whether it understood it or not. And at the center of it all, the rift remained open, a bleeding scar in reality that continued to pulse with unstable energy, threatening to unleash even more into a galaxy already on the brink. The war that had defined StarCraft had not ended. It had simply found a new battlefield, one far larger, far more complex, and far more dangerous than any of its factions could have imagined. If you want to see more characters and universes collide with the Star Wars galaxy, hit that like button, share this story with fellow fans, drop the next crossover you want to see in the comments, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because this is only the beginning, and what comes next will reshape the fate of the galaxy itself. The Force had always bound the galaxy together. But now, something had arrived that did not obey it. And the war for dominance had only just begun. The first Imperial response did not come from strategy or understanding. It came from routine. Patrol routes near the unknown regions were not designed for curiosity or caution. They were designed for control, for suppression, for the quiet enforcement of order in regions the Empire considered too unstable to matter yet too dangerous to ignore. When the communications blackout began, one outpost, then 3, then an entire sector going silent, the nearest Imperial task force responded exactly as protocol demanded. They advanced. 3 Imperial Star Destroyers dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the disturbance zone, their triangular silhouettes cutting through the void with imposing certainty. Their arrival was precise, calculated, and utterly confident. To the Empire, there were no unknowns, only threats waiting to be classified, subdued, and absorbed into the machinery of Imperial dominance. The commanders aboard those vessels expected pirates, perhaps a rogue faction, maybe even a hidden rebel cell operating in secrecy. What they did not expect was war on a scale and nature they had never encountered. The moment they exited hyperspace, their sensors erupted into chaos. Energy signatures flooded their systems, spiking beyond known thresholds and fluctuating in ways that defied standard classification. Massive vessels, unidentified, heavily armed, and unlike anything in the Imperial database, were already engaged in combat. Blasts of searing energy lit the darkness in rapid succession, colliding with writhing masses of something that was neither ship nor asteroid but unmistakably alive. The tactical officers hesitated, not out of fear, but confusion. There was no immediate framework to process what they were seeing. And in that hesitation, the first mistake was made. The lead Star Destroyer opened fire. Green turbolaser bolts lanced across space, striking a Terran battlecruiser that had only just stabilized after its violent arrival. The impact was immediate and devastating, the unfamiliar vessel rocking under the force of the barrage. For a fraction of a second, there was silence, a pause in the chaos as if the battlefield itself held its breath. Then the Terrans responded. Their retaliation was not elegant. It was not restrained. It was absolute. Yamato cannon energy surged from the battlecruiser's core, a concentrated beam of destructive force that tore through the void and slammed directly into the Star Destroyer's forward hull. The impact shattered shielding layers in an instant, punching deep into the armored structure beneath. Explosions rippled across the surface, cascading outward as internal systems failed under the sudden, overwhelming assault. The Imperial crew, trained for combat but not for this, scrambled to respond, their confidence cracking under the realization that this enemy did not fight by the rules they understood. But even as the exchange escalated, something far worse moved in the shadows of the battlefield. The Zerg had been watching. They did not perceive the conflict as Terrans versus Empire or Protoss versus anything. They perceived only opportunity. The energy discharge, the destruction, the debris, these were not obstacles. They were resources. The drifting wreckage of the damaged Star Destroyer became a beacon, drawing clusters of organic matter toward it with terrifying purpose. Tendrils extended, attaching themselves to the fractured hull, burrowing into exposed sections, spreading rapidly through corridors and compartments before the Imperial crew could even comprehend what was happening. Inside the Star Destroyer, the invasion was silent at first. A faint, wet sound echoing through ventilation shafts. A subtle distortion in the walls as organic material began to grow where metal once stood. Then came the screams. Stormtroopers, trained for battlefield combat against visible enemies, found themselves facing something entirely different. Creatures burst from the walls, their forms shifting even as they moved, adapting to the confined spaces of the ship. Blaster fire cut them down, but not fast enough, not completely. For every creature destroyed, another seemed to take its place, more resilient, more aggressive. The infection spread faster than orders could be issued, faster than containment protocols could activate. Within minutes, entire sections of the Star Destroyer were lost. Outside, the battle intensified. The remaining Imperial vessels, now fully aware that they were facing multiple unknown threats, attempted to regroup, their commanders issuing orders with increasing urgency. Turbolasers fired in coordinated volleys, targeting both Terran ships and the expanding Zerg masses that threatened to overwhelm everything in their path. But coordination required understanding, and understanding was something the Empire did not yet possess. The Terrans, for their part, were adapting quickly. Their commanders recognized the Imperial ships as organized, militarized forces, potential enemies, but also potential assets if communication could be established. But the Empire had already made its stance clear with its opening attack. There would be no diplomacy, not yet. Only survival. Battlecruisers shifted formation, their weapons systems recalibrating to account for the unique energy signatures of Imperial shielding. Missile barrages followed energy blasts, overwhelming defenses through sheer volume and variety. It was a style of warfare unfamiliar to the Empire, relentless, adaptive, and unbound by the rigid doctrines that defined Imperial strategy. And then the Protoss entered the engagement. Their arrival was not marked by chaos or desperation, but precision. Warp signatures flared briefly before their ships appeared, already aligned for optimal positioning. They did not hesitate. They did not observe. They acted. Energy beams, focused and impossibly controlled, lanced out from their vessels, targeting key points in both Terran and Imperial ships with surgical accuracy. Shields flickered, hulls ruptured, and systems failed under the onslaught. To the Protoss, this was not a battle to win in the traditional sense. It was a calculation, an assessment of threats that needed to be eliminated or contained. The Terrans were unpredictable. The Empire was aggressive. But the Zerg, spreading, evolving, consuming, were the true priority. Their psionic presence expanded outward as they fought, touching the edges of something vast and unfamiliar. The Force responded in kind, rippling back against their awareness. It was not hostile, but it was not passive either. It resisted classification, resisted control, and in doing so, it confirmed what the Protoss had already begun to suspect. This galaxy was not like their own. And it would not be easily conquered. Amid the chaos, one of the Imperial Star Destroyers attempted to retreat, its commander recognizing the impossibility of the situation. Hyperspace calculations were initiated, engines spooling up as the massive vessel prepared to escape and report back to the core systems. But escape required time, and time was something the Zerg did not allow. Organic growth had already spread across its hull, creeping along the surface like a living shadow. As the engines reached critical output, the biomass reacted, mutating in response to the sudden surge of energy. Structures formed, anchoring the ship in place, disrupting its ability to enter hyperspace. Within seconds, the vessel was no longer a warship. It was a host. The final transmission that escaped its comm systems was fragmented, distorted, but unmistakably filled with terror. Reports of living infestation, uncontrollable spread, and enemy unlike any known classification were cut short as the signal died, consumed along with the ship itself. The battlefield fell into a strange, uneasy rhythm after that. The Empire, battered and confused, began to withdraw, their surviving ships pulling back to safer distances as they attempted to regroup and reassess. The Terrans held their position, wary but resolute, their commanders already analyzing data, already adapting their strategies for what came next. The Protoss remained, their ships hovering with silent authority, their focus shifting toward the growing Zerg presence that now threatened to spread beyond this isolated conflict. And the Zerg thrived. What had begun as scattered biomass had now taken root, forming the early stages of a hive cluster anchored to debris and celestial bodies alike. Creatures moved with increasing coordination, their forms stabilizing as they adapted to the conditions of this new galaxy. And within that adaptation, the influence of the Force continued to shape them, subtly but undeniably. This was no longer an isolated incident. This was the beginning of an invasion. Far away, deep within the core of the Empire, the fragmented transmission reached its destination. It was incomplete, corrupted, but the message was clear enough. Something had entered the galaxy. Something that could not be easily controlled. Something that could not be ignored. And as the data was reviewed, analyzed, and ultimately delivered to the highest authority, one truth became impossible to deny. The Empire had fired the first shot. And it had not been enough. The first world to fall did not send a warning. It did not broadcast distress signals or call for aid from nearby systems. It simply went silent, its presence in the galaxy reduced to a flicker on long-range scanners before vanishing entirely beneath a growing mass of biological corruption. It was a mining colony on the far edge of the Outer Rim, insignificant by Imperial standards, valuable only for its mineral output and its proximity to unstable hyperspace routes. It was the perfect target, isolated, undefended, and unprepared for what descended upon it. The Zerg did not arrive as a fleet. They arrived as a contamination. Fragments of biomass, ejected during the initial rupture in the unknown regions, had drifted through hyperspace corridors in unstable, semi-organic clusters. Most burned away upon atmospheric entry, reduced to ash by friction and heat. But some survived. Some adapted even before they made contact, hardening their outer layers, reshaping themselves in response to environmental pressure. When they struck the surface of the mining world, they did not crash. They embedded. At first, the colonists mistook the impact for a minor meteor shower. The tremors were localized, the damage minimal. Mining operations resumed within hours, the incident logged and dismissed as routine. It was only when the first excavation team reported unusual readings beneath the surface that concern began to spread. Sensors detected organic material where none should exist, structures forming in patterns that did not align with any known life form. Orders were given to investigate. That was the second mistake. The tunnels beneath the colony were already changing. What had once been solid rock was now veined with pulsating tissue, the walls slick with a substance that absorbed light and sound alike. The air grew thick, humid, carrying a faint, metallic scent that clung to the lungs and dulled the senses. The deeper the team ventured, the more the environment resisted them, as if the planet itself had begun to reject their presence. And then, without warning, the walls moved. Creatures emerged not from hidden chambers or distant nests, but from the very structure of the tunnels themselves. Limbs formed where there had been none, claws extending from surfaces that had moments before been inert. The first miners did not even have time to react. They were taken instantly, dragged into the living walls as if consumed by the planet itself. Blaster fire followed, frantic and uncontrolled, illuminating the horror in brief, violent flashes. But the Zerg did not retreat. They adapted. Every shot fired, every attempt to resist, fed the evolution. Within minutes, the creatures began to shift, their forms hardening against energy impacts, their movements becoming faster, more precise. They learned not through thought, but through instinct, through the collective will of a swarm that existed beyond individual consciousness. And beneath it all, something new stirred. The Force. It was not something the Zerg understood, not in any conscious sense. But they felt it. A pervasive energy that saturated the galaxy, flowing through all living things, shaping existence in ways they had never encountered. And like everything else, they adapted to it. The first signs were subtle. A creature paused mid-attack, its movements momentarily erratic as if responding to something unseen. Another shifted its form without external stimulus, its structure altering in response to an influence that could not be measured or predicted. These were not random mutations. They were reactions to the Force itself, an unconscious attempt to integrate a new variable into the endless equation of evolution. Above the surface, the colony began to fall. Communications broke down first, signals disrupted by the rapid spread of organic growth across key infrastructure. Power grids failed as biomass infiltrated generators, converting energy into fuel for further expansion. Buildings collapsed not from external assault, but from internal corruption, their foundations replaced by living tissue that pulsed and expanded with relentless purpose. The colonists fought back, their defenses activating in fragmented bursts of resistance, but they were not fighting an enemy they could see or understand. They were fighting a process that could not be stopped. By the time the first distress signal managed to escape the planet's atmosphere, it was already too late. The transmission was chaotic, filled with fragmented reports of biological infestation, rapid structural conversion, and hostile organisms adapting to weapon fire. It reached a nearby Imperial outpost, triggering an immediate response. A small detachment of TIE fighters and a support frigate were dispatched to investigate, their pilots expecting unrest, perhaps a localized rebellion or a minor ecological disaster. What they found was something else entirely. From orbit, the planet no longer resembled a mining colony. Vast sections of its surface had been overtaken by a dark, organic mass that spread outward in branching patterns, consuming everything in its path. Structures were barely visible beneath the growth, their outlines distorted and broken. Movement was constant, subtle but undeniable, as if the planet itself had become a single, unified organism. The Imperial commander hesitated. Protocol dictated observation and reporting, not immediate engagement. But the situation did not align with any known classification of threat. There was no enemy fleet, no organized resistance, no clear target. Only growth. Uncontrolled, accelerating and expanding beyond the boundaries of the colony. He ordered a surface scan. The data that returned was incomplete, corrupted by interference from the biomass below. But what little could be interpreted confirmed the worst possibility. The life forms on the surface were not independent entities. They were part of a larger network, a collective system that functioned as a single organism. And it was spreading. The decision to engage was made quickly after that. TIE fighters descended into the atmosphere, their engines cutting through the thickening air as they approached the infected zones. Blaster fire rained down upon the surface, targeting visible clusters of biomass in an attempt to contain the spread. Explosions tore through the organic structures, sending fragments scattering across the terrain. For a brief moment, it seemed effective. Then the ground responded. Massive tendrils erupted from beneath the surface, striking upward with violent precision. TIE fighters were caught mid-flight, crushed or dragged downward into the living mass below. Those that managed to evade the initial assault found themselves facing something even more unsettling. The biomass was adapting to aerial threats, forming spore-like projectiles that launched into the sky, bursting upon impact and releasing corrosive material that ate through hull plating in seconds. The frigate above attempted to provide support, its turbolasers firing in controlled bursts to suppress the emerging threats. But the targeting system struggled to lock onto enemies that were constantly changing, constantly shifting. There was no stable pattern, no predictable behavior. Every strike forced a new adaptation, every tactic countered by evolution that occurred in real time. Within minutes, the Imperial force was overwhelmed. The surviving TIE fighters retreated, their numbers reduced, their pilots shaken by what they had witnessed. The frigate followed, its hull scarred, its systems strained under the assault. It did not attempt to re-engage. It could not. The threat below was not something that could be eliminated with conventional means. As the Imperial forces withdrew, the Zerg continued to grow. The colony was no longer a colony. It was a hive. Spire-like structures began to rise from the surface, their forms alien and grotesque, pulsing with energy drawn from the planet itself. Creatures moved with increasing coordination, their actions no longer purely reactive but directed, guided by an emerging intelligence that was beginning to take shape within the swarm. And beneath it all, the influence of the Force continued to shape their evolution, pushing them toward something new. Something dangerous. Far across the galaxy, the disturbance intensified. Sensitive individuals, those attuned to the Force, began to feel it more clearly now. Not just a ripple, but a growing presence, a distortion that did not align with the natural flow of life. It was not the darkness of the Sith, nor the balance sought by the Jedi. It was something else. Something that consumed without purpose, that adapted without restraint. And for the first time, the galaxy began to understand. This was not an invasion of armies. This was an invasion of existence itself. The silence that followed the fall of the mining world did not bring relief. It brought clarity, cold, precise, and deeply unsettling. Across the infected system, the void itself seemed altered, as if the absence of sound and light had taken on a weight it had never carried before. The Zerg presence was no longer scattered, no longer the chaotic residue of a violent arrival. It had rooted itself, begun the slow, deliberate transformation from drifting contamination into something structured, something purposeful. Vast tendrils of biomass extended across the planet's surface and into orbit, forming the early architecture of a hive that pulsed with life, with hunger, and with a strange, growing resonance that did not belong to their origin. That resonance called to something older. Far beyond the system's outer boundary, where the darkness remained untouched by infestation, space folded in upon itself with flawless precision. There was no violent rupture this time, no uncontrolled tearing of reality. Instead, it was a controlled distortion, a deliberate manipulation of dimensional boundaries. The Protoss fleet emerged not as survivors of chaos, but as masters of transition, their arrival marked by perfect alignment and immediate awareness of their surroundings. Their ships, radiant with golden energy and humming with psionic power, held position in silent formation as their collective consciousness expanded outward, touching the edges of this new galaxy. They did not see the Zerg infestation first. They felt it. The swarm's presence was unmistakable, a vast and writhing consciousness that existed not as individuals, but as a singular will distributed across countless forms. It was familiar, yet altered. The Zerg they had fought in their own universe had been driven by evolution, by consumption, by an endless hunger to adapt and overcome. But here, in this galaxy, something had changed. The swarm's essence was distorted, intertwined with something vast and ambient, something that permeated all living things in this reality. The Force. To the Protoss, it was not immediately understood, but it was undeniably present. It flowed through the system like an unseen current, touching every particle of life, binding existence together in a way that mirrored their own connection to the Kala, yet differed in its nature. Where the Kala was unity, structured and shared, the Force was chaotic in its distribution, vast and uncontained. And within it, the Zerg were evolving. That alone was enough to pass judgment. The Protoss did not act out of emotion. They did not rush into battle driven by fear or anger. Their decisions were calculated, rooted in a philosophy that valued balance, order, and the preservation of existence itself. The presence of the Zerg in any form was a threat. The presence of the Zerg adapting to a new, unknown energy that permeated an entire galaxy was something far worse. It was unacceptable. Without a word spoken aloud, the command passed through the Protoss fleet as a unified thought. Their ships shifted formation, energy systems intensifying as weapons charged with controlled precision. There was no hesitation, no debate. The conclusion had already been reached. Extermination. The first strike was surgical. A concentrated beam of psionic energy lanced from the lead Protoss vessel, cutting through the void with absolute accuracy before striking the surface of the infested planet. The impact did not explode outward like conventional weaponry. It pierced, burrowed, and then erupted from within, tearing through layers of biomass with devastating efficiency. The hive structures shuddered under the assault, their forms destabilizing as sections of organic architecture collapsed inward, reduced to inert matter before they could regenerate. For a brief moment, it seemed effective. Then the planet responded. The Zerg did not react with panic or disarray. They adapted. The destruction triggered a rapid evolutionary response, the biomass shifting its composition, hardening in some areas while becoming more flexible in others. New structures began to form almost immediately, their shapes influenced by the nature of the attack they had just endured. Spore-like organisms rose from the surface, launching themselves into orbit in dense clusters, each one carrying corrosive payloads designed to breach shields and hulls alike. The Protoss fleet did not retreat. Their shields flared as the first wave of spores collided with them, energy fields absorbing the initial impacts before recalibrating to counter the corrosive effects. Return fire was immediate, precise bursts of energy eliminating incoming threats before they could accumulate. But even as they held their ground, the Protoss understood what they were witnessing. This was not a static enemy. This was a system that learned. Below, the hive expanded its reach, tendrils extending further into orbit, attempting to anchor themselves to debris and fragments left behind from earlier conflicts. Each successful connection strengthened the network, increasing the swarm's capacity to respond, to evolve, to resist. And within that network, something new began to take shape. A presence. It was not yet fully formed, not yet a singular consciousness like the Overmind or the Queen of Blades from their own universe. But it was emerging, coalescing from the collective will of the swarm and the influence of the force that saturated this galaxy. It was aware, in a way that individual Zerg were not. It observed, it learned, and it began to guide. The Protoss felt it the moment it touched the edges of their perception. It was wrong. Not because it was powerful, but because it was unfamiliar in a way that defied their understanding. The force did not flow through it as it did through other living beings. It twisted around it, bent by its presence, altered by its nature. The Zerg were not simply adapting to the force. They were interacting with it, influencing it in return. That changed everything. The initial objective, containment and eradication of the swarm, was no longer sufficient. This was no longer just about the Zerg. This was about the stability of the galaxy itself. If the swarm continued to evolve in response to the force, if it began to integrate that energy into its biology in a meaningful way, it could become something far beyond anything the Protoss, or anyone, had ever faced. The judgment shifted. This was not a localized threat. This was a galactic crisis. The Protoss fleet expanded its formation, preparing for a sustained engagement rather than a swift elimination. Additional warp signatures flickered at the edges of the system as reinforcements were summoned, their arrival imminent. This was no longer a battle to end quickly. It was a war to be managed, controlled, and, if possible, contained before it spread beyond recovery. But even as they prepared, another presence began to press against their awareness. It was distant, yet focused. Dark, yet controlled. Unlike the chaotic adaptation of the Zerg or the structured unity of the Protoss, this presence carried intent. Deliberate, calculating, and deeply rooted in power. It was not part of the swarm, nor was it aligned with the Protoss. It was something native to this galaxy, something that had felt the same disturbance and now turned its attention toward the source. The Sith. Though the Protoss did not yet understand the full nature of this new faction, they recognized the danger immediately. This presence was not passive. It was watching, studying much like they were. And unlike the Zerg, it possessed intelligence, strategy, and a will that could shape events far beyond a single battlefield. The Protoss had entered a galaxy already divided. And now, their arrival had drawn the attention of something that ruled from its shadows. Below them, the Zerg continued to evolve, their forms growing more complex, their responses more refined. Above them, the Protoss prepared for a war that would not be easily won. And beyond the system, forces yet unseen began to move, drawn by the same disturbance that had shattered the balance of the galaxy. The judgment had been made. But the consequences of that judgment were only just beginning to unfold. The Empire did not fear the unknown. It categorized it, contained it, and if necessary, annihilated it. That had always been its strength, and its greatest flaw. Across the vast expanse of the galaxy, reports of alien fleets, living infestations, and impossible energy signatures had begun to converge into a single, undeniable truth. Something had entered Imperial space that did not belong. But within the towering spires of Coruscant, where power radiated outward like a controlled storm, that truth was not met with fear. It was met with ambition. In the shadowed throne room of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine sat in stillness, the dim glow of holographic projections casting flickering light across his hooded form. Before him, the fragmented reports played out in silence. Terran warships trading devastating fire with star destroyers, Protoss vessels cutting through fleets with surgical precision, and entire worlds succumbing to a spreading biological nightmare. To any other ruler, this would have been cause for alarm. To Palpatine it was opportunity. These newcomers were powerful. That much was certain. But power, in his experience, was never beyond control. It only required the right pressure, the right manipulation, the right application of fear and desire. The Sith had always understood this truth better than any other order. And now, as he reached outward through the dark side, probing the edges of these alien presences, he sought the same leverage he had used to bend the galaxy to his will. What he found disturbed him. The Protoss did not respond to his influence as other beings did. Their minds were not isolated entities, easily infiltrated or dominated. They were connected, unified through a psionic network that resisted intrusion with an almost impenetrable discipline. His attempts to probe deeper were met not with submission, but with resistance, calm, controlled, and absolute. They did not fear him. They did not even acknowledge him in the way he expected. The Zerg were worse. Where the Protoss resisted, the Zerg ignored. Their hive mind pulsed with a chaotic unity that defied the structure of the Force. It was alive, constantly shifting, adapting not just physically but instinctively to any influence that touched it. When Palpatine extended his will toward it, the response was not submission or defiance. It was evolution. The presence recoiled, adjusted, and then became something slightly different, as if the dark side itself had been analyzed and incorporated into the swarm's endless process of adaptation. For the first time in years, the Emperor felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, but limitation. His eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest crack in his otherwise absolute confidence. These were not factions that could be controlled through the Force alone. They would require a different approach, one rooted not just in power, but in strategy. And so, he turned to his most trusted instrument. Aboard the bridge of a Star Destroyer cutting through hyperspace, Darth Vader stood motionless, his presence dominating the space around him. The hum of the engines vibrated through the deck, a constant reminder of the power he commanded. When the Emperor's summons came, it was not through comms or transmissions. It was through the Force itself, cold, commanding, and undeniable. Vader listened. Orders were simple. Locate the leaders of these invading forces. Capture them if possible. Destroy them if necessary. Break their resistance and bring them under Imperial control. There was no hesitation. The fleet adjusted course immediately, emerging from hyperspace at the edge of contested space where Protoss and Terran forces had last been detected. Star Destroyers formed into attack formations, their massive frames blotting out the starlight as they advanced with relentless precision. To the Empire, this was how power was expressed, not through chaos or adaptation, but through overwhelming force and absolute dominance. The first contact came swiftly. Protoss vessels appeared without warning, warping into position with impossible accuracy. Their golden hulls shimmered with energy, shields already active, weapons primed. They did not open communication channels. They did not attempt negotiation. They simply observed. Vader did not wait. Fire. Turbolasers erupted in unison, green bolts of energy streaking across space toward the alien fleet. The attack was precise, coordinated, and devastating by any known standard of warfare. But the Protoss were not bound by those standards. Their response was immediate. Energy shields flared, absorbing the initial barrage before shifting, adapting to the frequency of the incoming fire. Then, with calculated precision, they retaliated. Beams of concentrated psionic energy lanced outward, striking the Star Destroyers at critical points. Shield generators, weapon arrays, command towers. Explosions rippled across the Imperial ships, systems failing under the sudden, targeted assault. Vader felt it. Not just the damage, but the intent behind it. These were not random attacks. They were strategic, deliberate, executed with a level of coordination that rivaled even the Empire's finest tacticians. The Protoss were not merely defending themselves. They were analyzing, learning, adapting. And they were not impressed. Vader extended his awareness through the Force, attempting to anticipate their movements, to find a weakness he could exploit. But their presence was different. It was there, undeniable, but it did not flow through the Force in the same way as other beings. It was as if their psionic energy existed parallel to the Force, intersecting with it but not bound by it. This was not an enemy he could simply overpower. Below the battle, the situation worsened. Imperial ground forces had been deployed to contain Zerg infestations on multiple worlds, operating under the assumption that overwhelming firepower would be sufficient. It was not. Reports flooded in, units overrun, weapons rendered ineffective, entire battalions lost within minutes. The Zerg did not fight like any enemy the Empire had faced. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They adapted. Blaster fire that had been effective moments before became useless as new strains emerged, their biology shifting to resist the energy. Vehicles were torn apart by creatures that had not existed minutes earlier, evolved specifically to counter Imperial tactics. Entire cities were consumed, their infrastructure converted into extensions of the hive. And worst of all, the spread could not be contained. Even as Imperial forces fought to hold the line, the infestation spread through unseen vectors, contaminated ships, infected cargo, even personnel who had unknowingly carried the corruption with them. The Empire's greatest strength, its vast network of systems and supply lines, had become its greatest vulnerability. Back on the bridge, Vader watched as another Star Destroyer took a direct hit from a Protoss beam, its hull splitting under the pressure. He did not react outwardly, but within the Force, his focus sharpened. This was no longer a simple mission. This was a test. The Emperor had believed these invaders could be controlled, bent to his will like every other force in the galaxy. But here, in the chaos of battle, that belief was beginning to fracture. The Protoss could not be intimidated. The Zerg could not be reasoned with. And the Terrans, though not yet fully engaged with his fleet, had already demonstrated a level of technological adaptability that rivaled the Empire's own. For the first time, the Empire faced enemies that did not fit into its understanding of power, and that made them dangerous. Far away, on Coruscant, Palpatine watched the battle unfold through live data streams, his expression unchanged. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind raced, recalculating, adjusting. This was not a setback. It was information. And information could be used. If these factions could not be dominated through force alone, then they would be studied, manipulated, turned against each other. The Protoss sense of order could be exploited. The Terran survival instincts could be redirected. Even the Zerg, mindless as they seemed, could become a weapon if guided correctly. The Empire would adapt. It always did. But as the first true engagement ended not in victory, but in costly realization, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Empire had underestimated the invaders. And in doing so, it had revealed its greatest weakness: arrogance. The Empire moved with rigidity, the Protoss with discipline, and the Zerg with instinct. But the underworld moved with something far more unpredictable: opportunity. As the first waves of conflict rippled outward from the unknown regions into the Outer Rim, it was not long before whispers began to spread through shadow ports, back-alley cantinas, and encrypted holonet channels. Strange weapons. Living ships. Entire worlds gone dark. For most, these were warnings. For smugglers, syndicates, and crime lords, they were invitations. In the lawless sectors beyond tight Imperial control, the galaxy's criminal networks were already adapting faster than any official authority. Black markets sprang to life almost overnight, fueled by scavenged debris from early battle sites and intercepted cargo drifting through unsecured hyperspace lanes. Among the most valuable prizes were Terran weapons, rugged, efficient, and unlike anything standard in the galaxy. Pulse rifles, powered armor fragments, and fragments of targeting systems began circulating quietly at first, then explosively as word spread of their effectiveness against both Imperial forces and the unknown alien threats. On a dimly lit docking platform carved into the surface of Nar Shadda's lower levels, deals were struck in hushed tones beneath flickering neon lights. Crates bearing unfamiliar markings were exchanged for credits, spice, and information. Smugglers who had once dealt in blasters and contraband now found themselves handling far more dangerous cargo. Terran Gauss rifles capable of piercing reinforced armor, compact missile systems designed for battlefield adaptability, and fragments of battlefield AI systems that could recalibrate targeting in real time. These were not relics. They were tools of war, and they sold quickly. The problem was not the weapons. It was what came with them. Unbeknownst to most traders, not all cargo recovered from the early battlefields was inert. Some shipments carried traces of something far more insidious: microscopic Zerg organisms, dormant but alive, clinging to metal surfaces, embedded within biological residue, or hidden within contaminated debris. The Zerg did not need ships to spread. They needed hosts. And the underworld provided them willingly. Freighters moved constantly between systems, often avoiding Imperial scrutiny by using unregistered hyperspace routes and outdated navigation data. These vessels became perfect carriers, transporting both Terran technology and unseen Zerg contamination across vast distances. A shipment that began as salvaged battlefield debris in the Outer Rim could end up in a mid-rim trade hub within days, its cargo distributed among dozens of buyers before anyone realized the danger. The first outbreaks were small. A cargo bay on a smuggler's freighter began to show signs of organic growth, dismissed initially as fungal contamination. Crew members reported strange sounds, wet, rhythmic movements within sealed crates, but ignored them in favor of profit. By the time they understood what they were dealing with, it was already too late. The infestation spread through ventilation systems, embedding itself into the ship's structure, converting metal into living tissue. The vessel never reached its destination. It drifted in space, its final transmission a distorted scream swallowed by static. But not all ships were lost. Some made it through. On the trade world of Ord Mantell, one such shipment arrived without incident, or so it seemed. The cargo was offloaded, distributed among local buyers, and integrated into existing supply chains. Weapons were sold. Components were repurposed. Crates were opened. And the infection began. At first, it manifested as subtle anomalies, equipment malfunctioning in unusual ways, surfaces developing organic textures, isolated disappearances in storage facilities. Local enforcers attributed it to sabotage or rival syndicate interference. Investigations were launched, accusations made, and retaliations carried out. All the while, beneath the surface, the Zerg spread. The infestation did not erupt in chaos immediately. It grew quietly, adapting to its environment, learning the rhythms of the world it had infiltrated. By the time the first visible outbreak occurred, a warehouse collapsing inward as living structures burst through its foundation, the Zerg had already established multiple nodes across the city. Containment was impossible. And still, the trade continued. For every smuggler who recognized the danger, there were 10 more willing to take the risk. The profits were too high, the demand too strong. Terran weapons were proving effective against both Imperial forces and early Zerg forms, creating a dangerous illusion of control. Syndicates began competing for access to these resources, escalating conflicts within the underworld itself. Turf wars erupted, not over territory, but over supply chains. Who controlled the flow of alien technology, who dictated its distribution, who profited the most. In this chaos, new alliances formed. Independent smugglers began working directly with Terran survivors, trading safe passage and local intelligence in exchange for weapons and support. These Terrans, disoriented but adaptable, recognized the value of such arrangements. They did not fully trust the underworld, but they understood it. In their own universe, survival had often depended on similar alliances, temporary, transactional, but effective. The Protoss, observing from a distance, saw something different. To them, the underworld was not merely opportunistic. It was dangerous in a way that transcended immediate conflict. These networks were accelerating the spread of the Zerg, turning isolated infestations into galaxy-wide threats. Every smuggling route became a potential vector, every transaction a risk. Yet direct intervention was complicated. The Protoss could not simply eradicate entire populations to prevent spread, not without violating the very principles that guided their existence. So they adapted. Small Protoss strike teams began targeting known smuggling hubs, not to destroy them outright, but to disrupt the flow of contaminated materials. Precision attacks eliminated key nodes in the network, forcing smugglers to relocate, to change routes, to become more cautious. It slowed the spread, but did not stop it. Meanwhile, the Empire struggled to maintain control. Imperial intelligence quickly identified the underworld as a contributing factor to the growing crisis, but their response was hindered by the very structure of the Empire itself. Bureaucracy delayed action. Commanders argued over jurisdiction. Resources were stretched thin between combating the Protoss, containing Zerg outbreaks, and maintaining order across thousands of systems. When action did come, it was brutal. Raids on suspected smuggling operations became increasingly common. Entire facilities wiped out under suspicion of contamination. Ships were intercepted, cargo destroyed, crews detained or executed. But the underworld was resilient. For every operation shut down, another emerged elsewhere. The network was too vast, too decentralized, too deeply embedded within the fabric of galactic trade. And beneath it all, the Zerg continued to spread. What made the situation truly dangerous was not just the speed of the infestation, but its unpredictability. Each new world presented different conditions, different challenges, and the Zerg adapted accordingly. On desert planets, they burrowed deep beneath the sands, emerging only when conditions were optimal. On urban worlds, they integrated into infrastructure, turning entire cities into extensions of the hive. On industrial planets, they fed on waste and energy, accelerating their growth beyond expected limits. The underworld had become more than a participant in the conflict. It had become a catalyst. Every deal, every shipment, every act of greed pushed the galaxy closer to a tipping point. The smugglers and syndicates did not intend to aid the invasion. They did not seek the destruction of entire systems. But intention no longer mattered. They had opened the door. And the Zerg were walking through it. Far beyond the reach of Imperial patrols and Protoss observation, new infestations began to take hold, small at first, then growing, connecting, forming a web of living networks that stretched across the galaxy. No longer confined to a single system, the swarm was expanding, its presence multiplying in ways that no single faction could fully track or contain. The war was no longer centralized. It was everywhere. And in the shadows of profit and survival, the galaxy itself was becoming the battlefield. The rebellion had always fought a war of shadows, striking where the Empire was weakest, vanishing before retaliation could arrive, surviving not through strength but through restraint and timing. It was a philosophy born of necessity, shaped by the overwhelming power of the Empire and the fragile hope that resistance could one day restore balance to the galaxy. But now, that balance was unraveling faster than even the most seasoned rebel leaders could comprehend. Reports flooded in from the outer rim and beyond, entire systems falling silent, not to Imperial occupation, but to something far worse. The Zerg were not conquering worlds. They were consuming them. Hidden within a concealed base deep in an asteroid field, the rebel leadership gathered in urgency. The war room flickered with holographic projections of infected systems, spreading like a disease across the galactic map. Red zones expanded outward in irregular patterns, unbound by political borders or strategic logic. Supply lines vanished. Refugee transmissions cut off mid-sentence. Worlds that had once been sympathetic to the rebellion were now lost entirely, their populations either dead or absorbed into something unrecognizable. Among those present, Leia Organa stood at the center of the discussion, her expression composed but strained beneath the weight of impossible choices. This was not the Empire they had trained to fight. This enemy could not be sabotaged through targeted strikes or weakened through propaganda. It did not fear them. It did not negotiate. It did not even acknowledge their existence beyond its usefulness as biomass. And yet, the rebellion could not simply abandon the galaxy to it. Intelligence briefings had confirmed what many already suspected. The Terrans, human but not of this galaxy, had established a foothold in contested space, their fleets engaging both Imperial forces and Zerg infestations with equal ferocity. Unlike the Empire, they adapted quickly, their technology flexible, their command structures decentralized enough to respond to rapidly changing conditions. More importantly, they fought the Zerg with an understanding that no one in this galaxy yet possessed. They knew how to survive it. This made them invaluable. It also made them dangerous. The debate within the rebellion was immediate and intense. Some argued that the Terrans represented the best chance to contain the Zerg, that an alliance, even a temporary one, could provide the knowledge and firepower needed to protect vulnerable systems. Others warned that introducing another powerful faction into the already fragile balance of the galaxy could have consequences just as devastating as the Zerg themselves. The Terrans were not bound by the same ideals as the rebellion. They were soldiers, survivors of a war that had shaped them into something pragmatic, sometimes ruthless. To trust them was to gamble the future of the rebellion itself. Beyond the strategic concerns lay a deeper, more personal conflict. The rebellion had always positioned itself as the moral counterpoint to the Empire, a force that fought not just for victory, but for justice. Aligning with an unknown military power, one capable of overwhelming force and untested in this galaxy's ethical framework, risked compromising that identity. It was not simply a question of survival. It was a question of who they would become in order to achieve it. Leia listened to every argument, weighing each perspective with the clarity that had made her one of the rebellion's most effective leaders. She understood the risks. She understood the stakes. But more than anything, she understood the cost of inaction. Because while the rebellion debated, worlds were dying. On the outskirts of a mid-rim system, a small rebel reconnaissance unit bore witness to that cost firsthand. Their mission had been simple: observe and report on suspected Zerg activity, avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. But what they found could not be ignored. A Terran task force was already there. Battlecruisers hovered in low orbit, their hulls scarred but operational, while dropships descended toward the planet's surface in coordinated waves. Below, the Zerg infestation had reached critical mass. Vast swaths of land transformed into pulsating hives that stretched for kilometers. The Terrans did not hesitate. They deployed with precision, siege tanks establishing firing lines while infantry units advanced behind them, their weapons tearing through Zerg formations with controlled efficiency. The rebels watched in silence. This was not the chaotic resistance they had grown accustomed to. It was structured, disciplined, and brutally effective. The Terrans understood the enemy in a way no one else did. They anticipated its movements, countered its adaptations, and pushed back against the swarm with a determination that bordered on relentless. For a moment, it seemed like victory was possible. Then the Zerg adapted. New forms emerged from the hive, larger, more resilient, their biology shifting in response to the Terran assault. The battle intensified, each side escalating in response to the other. The Terrans called in orbital support, devastating strikes that scorched entire sections of the planet to contain the spread. It worked, but at a cost. The planet was being saved. By destroying it, the rebel commander observing the battle felt the weight of that realization settle heavily. This was the reality of fighting the Zerg. There were no clean victories, no precise strikes that left the world intact. Survival required sacrifice on a scale the rebellion had never been forced to consider. When the Terrans finally secured the area, the cost was clear. Entire regions had been reduced to ash, their ecosystems destroyed to prevent further infestation. It was effective. It was necessary. And it was terrifying. Back in the war room, that report changed everything. The rebellion now faced a truth they could no longer ignore. The Terrans could fight the Zerg. They could hold the line where others would fall. But their methods were not bound by the same limitations the rebellion had imposed on itself. They would do what was necessary, regardless of the cost. The question was no longer whether the rebellion could win this war alone. It was whether they could afford to. Leia stood before the assembled leaders, the weight of the galaxy's future resting on her decision. She knew that any path forward would carry consequences. To remain hidden, to continue their fight against the Empire while ignoring the Zerg threat, would preserve their principles, but at the cost of countless lives across the galaxy. To ally with the Terrans would provide the means to fight back, to protect those worlds, but risk transforming the rebellion into something unrecognizable. There was no perfect choice, only necessary ones. And as the map of infected systems continued to expand, as more signals went dark, as the reality of the invasion became impossible to deny, the rebellion stood at a crossroads that would define its future. Not just as a resistance, but as a force willing to decide the fate of the galaxy itself. The Empire had always believed that power, once understood, could be controlled. That belief had forged its dominance, shaped its doctrine, and justified its cruelty. Yet the Zerg were not a power to be understood in simple terms, nor contained through conventional means. They were instinct made flesh, evolution accelerated beyond reason, a force that adapted not through study, but through survival itself. And to the Sith, that made them irresistible. Deep beneath the surface of an Imperial research facility hidden within the volcanic world of Mustafar, the air trembled with heat and something far more dangerous. Laboratories carved into obsidian rock pulsed with red illumination, their walls lined with containment fields that struggled to hold what lay within. Here, far from the prying eyes of the Senate or even most of the Imperial command, experiments were underway that would never be recorded in official logs. This was not science in the traditional sense. It was ambition, unchecked, absolute, and driven by the dark side. Emperor Palpatine stood at the heart of it all, observing as a captured mass of Zerg biomass writhed within a reinforced energy field. It had been harvested from a recent outbreak, isolated at great cost by Imperial forces who barely understood what they had secured. Even in containment, the organism shifted constantly, tendrils forming and dissolving, its surface rippling as if searching for something to consume, to adapt to become. Palpatine did not see a threat. He saw potential. The Zerg's ability to evolve, to absorb and improve upon every challenge, was unlike anything in the galaxy. The Sith had long sought to transcend the limitations of flesh and mortality, to harness the Force in ways that defied natural law. Here, before him, was a biological system that already did so, without restraint, without morality, without hesitation. If that power could be guided, shaped by the will of the dark side, it could become something unprecedented. Not just a weapon. A transformation. The experiments began subtly. Sith alchemists and Imperial scientists worked in tandem, exposing the biomass to controlled bursts of dark side energy, observing how it reacted. At first, the results were inconclusive. The Zerg did not resist the energy. It absorbed it just as it absorbed everything else. But unlike previous stimuli, the dark side did not simply trigger adaptation. It provoked something deeper. Recognition. The biomass began to change in ways that defied even its own established patterns. Tendrils hardened into blade-like structures that pulsed with unnatural energy. Its surface darkened, veins of crimson light spreading through its form as if the dark side itself had taken root within it. The organism was not just evolving. It was awakening. Palpatine felt it through the Force, a new presence forming, not separate from the Zerg, but layered atop it. Where the hive mind had once been a chaotic chorus of instinct, there was now a faint thread of intent, something sharper, more focused. It was not intelligence in the traditional sense. It was hunger, refined and directed, infused with the same relentless ambition that defined the Sith. This was no longer just Zerg. It was something else. The Emperor's lips curled into a thin smile. This was the breakthrough he had been seeking. A fusion of biology and the dark side, a living weapon that could evolve not just physically, but spiritually, adapting to the Force itself. With enough refinement, it could be unleashed upon the galaxy, a force that would not merely conquer worlds, but corrupt them at their very essence. But even Palpatine, for all his foresight, underestimated the nature of what he had created. The first signs of instability were subtle. Containment fields began to fluctuate, their energy readings spiking unpredictably as the biomass reacted to the dark side infusion. The organism's growth accelerated beyond projected limits, expanding rapidly within its confines, pressing against the barriers with increasing force. Scientists adjusted the parameters, reinforcing the fields, increasing power output, convinced that the anomaly was simply a phase of adaptation. They were wrong. The biomass was not adapting to the containment. It was learning from it. Each pulse of energy, each attempt to restrain it, was analyzed and incorporated into its evolution. The dark side had not granted it obedience. It had given it direction, and with that direction came purpose. The organism began to emit its own energy, a corrupted echo of the Force that interfered with the facility's systems. Instruments malfunctioned. Readings became erratic. And within the Force, a disturbance began to spread, subtle at first, then growing stronger. Even Darth Vader, present within the facility as both enforcer and observer, felt it. It was wrong in a way he could not fully articulate. The dark side was familiar to him. Its anger, its power, its clarity. But this was something else. It was not controlled. It was not channeled. It was raw, instinctive, and yet infused with the same destructive potential. It did not serve the dark side. It consumed it. Vader approached the containment chamber, his mechanical breathing echoing through the chamber as he studied the shifting mass within. Through the Force, he reached out, probing it, attempting to understand its nature. For a brief moment, there was contact. And then, something reached back. The connection was immediate and violent. Images flooded his mind. Not thoughts, not emotions, but impulses. Hunger. Expansion. Adaptation. And beneath it all, a growing awareness, a recognition of him not as a master, but as a resource. Vader recoiled, severing the connection, but the damage was done. This was not a tool. It was not something that could be commanded. It was becoming something that could challenge even the Sith. Palpatine felt the same shift, though he masked it beneath his calm exterior. The experiment had exceeded expectations, but not in the way he had intended. The fusion of Zerg evolution and dark side energy had created a new form of life, one that did not distinguish between master and prey. It did not seek guidance. It sought growth. And now it was outgrowing its cage. The containment fields failed without warning. One moment, the chamber held. The next, it shattered under the pressure of the organism's expansion, energy barriers collapsing as the mutated biomass surged outward. It moved faster than any recorded Zerg form, its tendrils lashing out, piercing through equipment, walls, and personnel alike. Where it touched, it did not merely infect. It transformed. Imperial scientists screamed as their bodies were overtaken, their forms twisting into new shapes, fused with the corrupted biomass. These were not standard Zerg conversions. The dark side had altered the process, creating entities that radiated a disturbing presence in the Force, neither fully alive nor entirely consumed, but something in between. Something unnatural. Vader ignited his lightsaber in an instant, the crimson blade cutting through the advancing mass. With surgical precision. Yet even as he struck, he saw the problem. The biomass did not simply retreat. It adapted, hardening against the blade, redirecting its growth, learning from the attack. Each strike slowed it but did not stop it. Palpatine unleashed the full force of his power, arcs of Force lightning tearing through the chamber, incinerating sections of the organism. For a moment, it seemed effective. The biomass recoiled, its form destabilizing under the assault. Then it changed. The lightning no longer burned it as before. Instead, it began to dissipate across its surface, absorbed, redirected, its energy feeding into the organism's growth. The dark side, once a weapon against it, had become a resource. This was the consequence of their arrogance. They had not created a servant. They had created a new apex. Alarms blared throughout the facility as the infestation spread beyond containment, breaching into surrounding corridors, consuming everything in its path. Imperial security forces engaged, but their weapons proved increasingly ineffective as the organism adapted in real time. What had begun as an experiment had become an outbreak, one far more dangerous than any previous Zerg infestation. Because this one understood the Force. As the facility descended into chaos, Palpatine stood unmoving, his mind racing through possibilities, recalculating, adapting. This was not failure. It was evolution, just not his own. The question now was not how to control it, but how to survive it. And as the corrupted swarm spread beyond Mustafar, carrying with it the fusion of dark side energy and Zerg instinct, the galaxy faced a new threat, one born not from invasion alone, but from the Empire's own ambition. A threat that could not simply be fought, because it was learning how to fight back. The galaxy had known war before. It had endured the clone wars, the rise of the Empire, and countless conflicts that reshaped systems and shattered civilizations. But nothing in its long and violent history, had prepared it for what now unfolded near the galactic core. This was not a war of two sides, nor even three. It was a collision of realities, philosophies, and powers that had never been meant to coexist. And at its center, everything would be decided. The core worlds, long considered the heart of civilization, became the stage for this decisive confrontation. Massive hyperspace signatures tore open across key systems as fleets arrived not in waves, but in overwhelming convergence. Imperial Star Destroyers formed defensive perimeters around critical planets, their formations tight and disciplined, bristling with turbolasers and fighter squadrons. The Empire would not yield its core, not to invaders, not to rebels, not to anything. But this was no longer a war the Empire could control. From the edges of sensor range, Protoss armadas emerged in silent brilliance, their golden vessels slipping into real space with impossible precision. Their arrival was not chaotic, but deliberate, strategically placed to intercept Zerg leviathans that loomed like living planets, their massive forms blotting out entire starfields. Beneath them, the swarm churned, spreading through orbital debris, infested ships, and corrupted stations that had once served as vital trade and military hubs. And then came the Terrans. Battlecruisers thundered into the fray, their engines burning like artificial suns as they positioned themselves between the advancing Zerg and the populated worlds behind them. Dropships deployed in rapid succession, ferrying mechanized infantry and siege units to contested orbital platforms and planetary surfaces. Their tactics were immediate, aggressive, and adaptive, focused not on territory, but on containment. The rebellion arrived last. Not in overwhelming force, but in precision. Smaller fleets, coordinated and agile, slipped through gaps in the chaos, targeting key objectives, evacuation corridors, communication relays, and vulnerable Zerg nodes that threatened civilian populations. They were not here to dominate the battlefield. They were here to save what could still be saved. For a brief, impossible moment, all factions occupied the same space. And then the battle began. The first volleys lit up the void with blinding intensity. Imperial turbolasers clashed with Protoss energy beams, their impacts rippling across shields and hulls alike. TIE fighters swarmed in coordinated patterns, only to be met by Protoss interceptors that moved with fluid, almost unnatural grace. Each side fought with precision, but neither could gain a decisive advantage, not while the true enemy loomed. The Zerg struck without hesitation. Leviathans surged forward, launching waves of bioprojectiles that collided with fleets in explosive bursts of corrosive energy. Smaller bioforms spilled into space, attaching themselves to ships, burrowing into hulls, spreading infestation even as battles raged. Entire Imperial cruisers were compromised within minutes, their systems overridden as organic growth consumed their interiors. But this was not the Zerg the galaxy had first encountered. This was something worse. From within the swarm, new forms emerged, twisted, pulsating with a dark energy that distorted the very fabric of the Force. These were the results of the Empire's experiments, the fusion of Zerg evolution with dark side corruption. Their presence disrupted Force sensitivity, clouding perception, twisting instincts. Jedi who had arrived to aid in evacuation efforts found their connection strained, their clarity replaced by a suffocating sense of wrongness. Even Darth Vader felt it. From the bridge of his flagship, he watched as one of these corrupted bioforms tore through a Star Destroyer's hull, its movements faster, more deliberate than any Zerg strain before it. He reached out through the Force, seeking to anticipate its actions, but what he encountered was not the familiar chaos of the swarm. It was intent, focused, hungry, aware. Vader moved without hesitation, launching himself into the battle aboard a command shuttle that plunged directly into the heart of the conflict. Around him, the war escalated beyond any previous engagement. Protoss carriers unleashed swarms of interceptors that carved through Zerg formations, their movements coordinated with near-perfect synchronization. Terran battlecruisers fired sustained volleys, their Yamato cannons tearing apart Leviathans in bursts of blinding energy. And still, the swarm advanced. On the surface of key core worlds, the situation was no less catastrophic. Cities became battlegrounds as Terran forces deployed alongside rebel units, forming defensive lines against encroaching Zerg hordes. Siege tanks anchored positions, their heavy artillery blasting through waves of bioforms, while rebel infantry coordinated evacuations under relentless pressure. The alliance was not formal. It was necessary. Above them, Protoss warp-ins delivered elite warriors directly into the thick of combat, their psionic blades cutting through corrupted Zerg forms with devastating precision. For the first time, their attacks seemed to have lasting effect, not just destroying the creatures, but destabilizing the dark side energy within them. They had found a weakness, but exploiting it would come at a cost. Back in orbit, the Imperial fleet began to falter under the combined pressure of Protoss precision and Zerg aggression. Palpatine's forces, once the dominant power of the galaxy, were now just one faction among many, forced into a reactive position. And for the Emperor, watching from afar, the realization was unavoidable. This battle would decide everything. Not just the fate of the core worlds, but the future of the galaxy itself. Because for the first time, the outcome was uncertain. The Empire could not dominate all sides. The Protoss could not contain the swarm alone. The Terrans could not hold every front. And the rebellion could not save everyone. Every faction was stretched to its limit. Every choice carried consequences. And as the battle reached its peak, as fleets burned and worlds trembled, one truth became clear above all others. This was not just a war. It was a decisive moment. A single, irreversible point where victory or annihilation would define the galaxy forever. The battle for the core worlds did not end with a single explosion or a clear declaration of victory. It ended in fragments, burning fleets drifting through space, shattered orbital platforms collapsing into planetary atmospheres, and entire regions of the galactic core left scarred beyond recognition. What had been the center of civilization was now a graveyard of ambition, arrogance, and survival. The decisive confrontation had passed, but its consequences would echo across the galaxy for generations. In the immediate aftermath, silence fell, not peace, but exhaustion. Every faction that had entered the conflict emerged diminished, changed, or broken in ways they could not yet fully understand. The Empire, once the unchallenged authority of the galaxy, found its grip weakened. Entire fleets had been lost, key systems destabilized, and, perhaps most damaging of all, the illusion of absolute control had been shattered. For the first time, the Empire had not dictated the outcome of a war. It had endured it. At the center of that realization stood Emperor Palpatine, watching the remnants of his fleet regroup across fractured hyperspace lanes. His expression remained calm, as it always did, but beneath that stillness, his mind had already begun to shift. This was not defeat. It was transformation. The galaxy had changed, and so too must the Empire. Control would no longer come from dominance alone. It would require adaptation, subtlety, manipulation, and a deeper understanding of the forces now at play. The Sith had sought to bend the Zerg to their will. Instead, they had unleashed something that could not be contained. The corrupted strains, born from the fusion of dark side energy and Zerg evolution, had not been eradicated in the battle. They had retreated, scattered across the galaxy, their presence now faint but persistent within the Force. These were no longer simple bioforms. They were something new, entities that existed at the intersection of instinct and corruption, capable of influencing the Force in ways that defied both Jedi and Sith understanding. And they were still growing. The Protoss, though victorious in many engagements, did not celebrate. Their fleets remained in orbit around key systems, their presence a silent, watchful constant. They had succeeded in slowing the spread of the swarm, in identifying weaknesses within the corrupted strains, but they had not eliminated the threat. For the Protoss, this was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a long vigilance. Their philosophy, once rooted in controlled intervention, had been challenged by the realities of this galaxy. The presence of the Force, the unpredictability of local factions, and the emergence of dark side, infused Zerg had forced them to reconsider their approach. They could no longer remain distant observers or precise executioners. The scale of the threat demanded something more, cooperation, even with species and factions they did not fully understand. For the first time, the Protoss began to integrate themselves into the fabric of the galaxy, not as conquerors, but as guardians. The Terrans, ever pragmatic, adapted fastest of all. Their forces, though heavily battered, had proven their value in the conflict. They had held lines that others could not, contained outbreaks that would have otherwise consumed entire sectors, and demonstrated a flexibility that even the Empire could not match. In the aftermath, they did not seek to dominate or claim territory outright. Instead, they established fortified zones, defensive networks designed to monitor and respond to Zerg activity wherever it emerged. These zones became hubs of cooperation, where local systems, rebel forces, and even independent factions could coordinate efforts against the lingering threat. Terran commanders, shaped by endless war in their own universe, understood one truth better than anyone else in the galaxy: the Zerg were never truly defeated. They were only ever contained. And containment required constant vigilance. The rebellion faced its own transformation. The war had forced them to step beyond their role as insurgents, to act not just in opposition to the Empire, but in defense of the galaxy itself. Their cooperation with the Terrans had blurred lines that once seemed absolute. They had witnessed the necessity of difficult choices, the cost of survival when faced with an enemy that offered no alternatives. For leaders like Leia Organa, the aftermath was both a victory and a burden. The rebellion had saved countless lives, helped turn the tide in key battles, and proven that unity, however fragile, could stand against overwhelming odds. But they had also seen what it meant to compromise, to accept methods that did not always align with their ideals. The question now was not whether they could defeat the Empire. It was what kind of galaxy they would build in the process. Across the Outer Rim and beyond, the underworld adapted as it always did. Smugglers, syndicates, and mercenary groups shifted their operations, some retreating from the dangers of Zerg contamination, others exploiting new opportunities created by the fractured balance of power. Terran weapons remained in circulation, now better understood but still highly sought after. Black markets adjusted, evolving alongside the new reality, their influence continuing to shape events in ways that no central authority could fully control. Even they had learned a lesson. Some things were too dangerous to exploit without consequence. Yet perhaps the most profound change was not in fleets or factions, but in the Force itself. The presence of the Zerg, the Protoss, and the dark side mutations had altered its balance in subtle but undeniable ways. Jedi who meditated upon it felt disturbances unlike anything recorded in their teachings, currents that shifted unpredictably, echoes of alien consciousness that did not align with the traditional understanding of light and dark. The Force was no longer just the domain of this galaxy. It had been touched by something beyond it, and that touch would not fade easily. In the void between systems, where the remnants of the great battles still drifted, a quiet transformation continued. Isolated Zerg strains, some pure, others corrupted by dark side energy, began to reorganize. Without a single central directive, they adapted, forming new patterns, new hierarchies. They were no longer simply invaders. They were becoming part of the galaxy. A new variable in every equation, a constant threat that could rise again at any moment. And watching it all, from the shadows of power and the edges of perception, every major faction understood the same truth, even if they would never admit it openly. The galaxy they had known was gone. In its place stood something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more unpredictable. A balance not defined by a single dominant power, but by the tension between many. Empire, rebellion, Protoss, Terrans, and the ever-present Zerg, all now intertwined in a struggle that would not end with a single battle, but continue as a defining reality of existence. Dominance was no longer absolute. Survival was no longer guaranteed. And control, true control, had become something no one could fully claim. In the end, the invasion of StarCraft forces into the Star Wars galaxy did not result in simple conquest or clear victory. It resulted in transformation. The Empire learned that even its vast power had limits, that not all forces could be bent to its will. The rebellion discovered that survival sometimes demanded choices that blurred the line between idealism and necessity. The Protoss and Terrans, strangers to this galaxy, became integral to its future, not as conquerors, but as guardians and survivors in a war that would never truly end. And the Zerg, they became something more than invaders. They became a part of the galaxy's ecosystem of conflict, a living reminder that evolution does not ask permission, and that some threats cannot be eradicated, only endured. The Force itself was changed by their presence. No longer confined to the philosophies of Jedi and Sith, it now carried echoes of something older, more primal, and infinitely adaptive. What that would mean for future generations, no one could say. But one thing was certain: the balance of the Force had been altered in ways that would take centuries to understand. This what if was never just about invasion. It was about collision. A collision of universes, of philosophies, of definitions of power. And from that collision emerged a new truth, one that reshaped everything the galaxy believed about dominance, survival, and control. Because in a galaxy once defined by the struggle between light and dark, a third force had arrived. Not to replace them, but to challenge them both. And as the stars burned on and hyperspace lanes reformed around the scars of war, the survivors, Empire, Rebels, Protoss, Terrans, looked toward an uncertain future, knowing that whatever came next would not be fought on familiar terms. The rules had changed. The galaxy had changed. And somewhere, in the quiet darkness between systems, the swarm was still evolving.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if